Senator Bernie Sanders was interviewed by Ash Sarkar of Novara Media on whether Israel's actions constitute a genocide, and here is what he had to say.
In your view, is what Israel is doing in Gaza a genocide?
In my view, it is absolutely disgraceful, horrible, and I'm doing, as a United States Senator, everything I can to end it. And where I'm sitting is, and I don't know how many people know this, every year the United States provides about $3.5 billion in military aid to Israel. On top of that, there is a bill. I was supposed to be here earlier. Couldn't come because a bill came up for, not just all for Israel, $95 billion, including $14 billion for Israel. And I have led the opposition to that. I do not want to see the United States complicit in what Netanyahu and his right-wing lunatic friends are doing right now to the Palestinian people. So my job right now is to support what the United Nations is trying to do, have a humanitarian ceasefire, see if we can get the humanitarian aid immediately in there, and work out, as complex and difficult as it is, some type of long-term solution to what's going on there.
Now, American statesmen so far firmly refusing to call the war in Gaza a genocide. Briahna here had the chance to interview Democratic candidate Dean Phillips the other day on her podcast. Here's some of that.
But Israel has been attacked since the day it was established by the free world after the Holocaust. It was attacked by its neighbors, and they survived.
That's like saying that American settlers were attacked by Native Americans because they were white or because they were Christian.
Oh, boy, Briahna, holy moly, boy! I'm telling you, I got to tell you, I'm expressing empathy for Palestinians, for Muslims, for Black Americans. I'm not feeling what I'm surprised, to be honest with you, and I'm offended.
What is surprising about this, Representative?
I'm just surprised. I'm surprised by the lack. I just explained it. I'm surprised by the lack of empathy of progressives relative to the Jewish people.
Meanwhile, during arguments made at the ICJ over accusations of Israeli genocide, Palestinian ambassador to the UN, Riyad Mansour, held back tears during an emotional speech begging for an end to Israel's genocide in the region. Let's take a look.
To guide us towards a future in which Palestinian children are treated as children. Not as demographic threat, in which the identity of the group to which we belong does not diminish the human rights to which we are all entitled. A future in which no Palestinian and no Israelis is killed. A future in which two states live side by side in peace and security. The Palestinian people only demand respect for their rights. They ask for nothing more. They cannot accept nothing less and nothing else.
Now, Mansour wasn't the only one who begged the court to do something about the situation in Gaza. Peter Andreas Stemmet, representing South Africa's legal team, urged the court to use the example of his own country's illegal occupation of Namibia with the current situation in Gaza. Let's look.
Mr. President, members of the court, Israel's total disdain and disrespect for these principles result in the occupation being inherently and fundamentally illegal in terms of international law. Just as South Africa's prolonged presence in Namibia was found by this court to be illegal.
Let's start with the Bernie clip up top. Now, I think the most viral aspect of that clip we didn't necessarily play, and it's when Ash asks Bernie 3 different times if he would describe what's going on in Gaza as a genocide, and he declined to answer. She asked him repeatedly if he would support economic, cultural, or sporting boycotts against Israel, and he says he's skeptical of those. And then she asked a really great follow-up saying, well, were you similarly skeptical of boycotts against South Africa that were so instrumental in ending apartheid there? And he gives a sort of meandering, unsatisfying answer. And others pointed out that he has supported sanctions, economic sanctions, and boycotts in other kinds of countries, Venezuela, Russia, North Korea. He's voted for them all. But there does seem to be this kind of exceptionalism in place when it comes to Israel. And given that, to Bernie's point, he has been doing so much more than other people in Congress. He has tried to get America to follow its own laws, restricting aid to countries that are enacting humanitarian abuses. All of these things make it almost more frustrating and more bizarre that he won't go that extra length to being open to even entertaining the word genocide or following the same sorts of, or using the same kind of tools that he has endorsed using in other contexts to try to bring a country into compliance with international law.
This is going to be an interesting day as you criticize Bernie and I guess I defend him. Look, he's taking what are, in my view and in your view as well, based on what you said, the correct votes in terms of giving, in terms of hopefully reining in the amount of just unlimited foreign aid we give to Israel and other countries. That's, you know, he's not a leader of a social movement or an activist. He's a legislator, and at the end of the day, if he's taking the right votes, and I agree with him on this, I think actually describing it as a genocide has not actually been proven. It's clearly very fraught and divisive. I would describe it as a war between a state and a terrorist group that acts as a sort of de facto head of state for the region it controls, in which there has been massive civilian casualties. Maybe you don't see any distinction, and that's fine, and I'm entertaining and listening to your arguments. At the end of the day, it seems much less important for Bernie Sanders to endorse your view or Ash's view of what's actually going on. If not doing that gives him more license to actually lead an effort to stop sending American tax dollars overseas to every other country, it seems like that's fine to me.
Well, for one, I don't know that there's a connection between those two things, whether or not he says his magic word and his ability to take the votes that he's taken, most of which are unsuccessful because he represents a real minority in Congress. But to your broader point, I'd agree. I don't think he needs to say, I know conclusively under the law that this is definitionally genocide. I don't know that he is actually in a position to be able to say that. But what we do know is maybe not Bernie, but many, many, many other members of Congress have been very willing to use that word in an extra legal context when talking about Ukraine or other countries. Very quick to say that's a genocide there. And moreover, I don't think the ask is that Bernie say, I know because I got a law degree that this is genocide, but to say the ICJ has said that there's a plausible case of genocide here in Israel. We need to take this very seriously, and we need to be acting toward Israel like we would toward any other state that had been charged with such serious crimes. Moreover, we don't need this genocide assessment in order to have a viewpoint as to whether or not things like sanctions are appropriate, things like boycotts are appropriate. And it does feel like he's very specifically trying to tiptoe around being associated with the BDS movement, which has been so politically polarized, even made illegal in some parts of the United States of America in a way that is a significant infringement on speech. And that's what's driving his choice of words there, as opposed to any principle.
Yeah, I wouldn't describe Russia's actions toward Ukraine as genocidal either. They're about territorial conquest. It's a pretty straightforward war between nation states where they're trying to claim more territory. Again, that's not to lessen the badness of it. It was illegal and wrong for them to do that. It's resulted in tons of human suffering. So too has ongoing conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. And, I hope all of these conflicts are resolved, and that the role of the U.S. should be to work toward resolution in both cases. It seems like that's not the role we're serving. Our current government is serving in terms of both conflicts, because we're not happy with Netanyahu's doing, apparently, but we continue to give them unlimited funding, and we seem to have scuttled potential negotiations early on between Ukraine and Russia. And now, even though we're not really willing necessarily to give them more funding, we're kind of leaving that ambiguous, because Biden would certainly like to give them more funding. He's just hamstrung from doing it because Republicans aren't willing to go along with it. Anyway, I expect from my legislators to be more protective of U.S. national security interests, more protective of taxpayer funding, more skeptical that sending more money abroad or financing wars in other parts of the world is in the best interest of the people there or our own best interests. So as long as people are doing. I wish more legislators would take that position, would follow the examples of Bernie Sanders and also a handful of Republicans who have taken similar positions. Many more of them on Ukraine, fewer on Israel, unfortunately. But there we have it.
To take this a bit to the Dean Phillips conversation, one thing that came out in some of Bernie's remarks and Dean Phillips' remarks is as a trend toward focusing on Netanyahu as a unique bad actor in Israel. A lot of what might be described as liberal Zionists say, I agree that there's a humanitarian crisis. I agree that Israel is over the top, to use Joe Biden's words, in its actions, but they largely place the blame on Netanyahu's right-wing government and say things like, well, I hope the people of Israel stand up and vote him out and choose to behave differently going forward. But that does seem to be a way to sidestep a substantive issue that we got into in a really spicy and I think useful debate for people to go and watch, where we got to the fundamental question of, Dean Phillips brought up the horrors of the Holocaust and the experience of the loss of 6 million Jewish people as a kind of grounds for why there is a legitimacy to needing a safe space in the state of Israel. And I put the following question to him: why should that state be in Palestine? Why should Palestinians who had nothing to do with the Holocaust, who had nothing to do with the anti-Semitism that precluded Jewish people from immigrating to America and other parts of Europe at the time and shortly thereafter, be the ones that have to pay the cost for this legitimate and horrific historical experience? And that's where we kind of came at loggerheads and the conversation really escalated. And in fact, he ended up ending the interview prematurely. He said he had some tasks to engage with and that he would come back to the show. We'll see if that's ultimately true. But I highly recommend people go and listen to that interview in full over on Bad Faith, because it really does, I think, provide an example of what liberal Zionist kind of maneuvering is. And if you are someone who is more ideologically committed to the idea of a Palestinian state, I think it's useful to be able to track the kind of rhetorical moves that end up happening that make it seem like a much more humane approach to the issue without fundamentally giving full rights and privileges to Palestinians that are being extended to Israelis and everybody else who has a state in the world.
Maybe Dean Phillips can wrap up this conversation on our show.
Yeah, that would be great.
Have him on. More Rising right after this.